If you've ever been pulled over in the United States, pay attention to this right now, because what I'm about to tell you could be the difference between walking away with a warning or walking away in handcuffs. After more than 15 years representing drivers, I've seen hundreds of cases that could have been resolved with a simple yes sir or no sir, and instead turned into a nightmare because the person thought they needed to explain themselves. There are 3 phrases drivers say to police officers every single day, thinking they're being polite, cooperative, honest, and in reality, they're handing over ammunition against their own case. I'm not here to teach you to confront the police. This isn't about that. It's about knowing your rights. Because nobody else is going to teach you this, and the police certainly won't. If you drive in the United States, this video could literally save you from a ticket, an arrest, or a court battle that never needed to happen. Before we continue, hit that like button now because it helps more people see this video, and subscribe to the channel because every week I bring you real cases and rights that nobody tells you about. Now come with me and I'll show you exactly what these 3 phrases are. Picture the scene. You're driving down some road, let's say a highway in Florida or a busy avenue in Houston, Texas. Suddenly, those red and blue lights show up in your rearview mirror. Your heart starts racing. You already know it's a traffic stop. You do everything right. You signal. You pull over calmly in a safe spot. You turn off the engine, roll down the window, put your hands on the wheel, clearly visible. The officer approaches and asks for your driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance. You hand everything over, trying to look calm, cooperative, the kind of person who's like, I'm a good citizen. I have nothing to fear here. And that's exactly the moment when most problems begin. Not because the driver did something wrong before, not because they were driving recklessly. The problem starts because, in their eagerness to show they're a decent person, they start talking more than they should. Nervousness makes us want to fill the silence. We want to explain, justify, get ahead of whatever the officer is about to ask. And it's precisely that desire to seem cooperative, to seem honest, to seem like a good person, that ends up creating problems that didn't exist before that stop even began. I need to make one thing very clear before I continue. This is not about disrespecting an officer, arguing with them, or creating a confrontation on the side of the road. That's the last thing you want to do during a stop. Police officers have a difficult job, and most just want to check the situation and move on. What I want to show you are the words. Phrases that sound completely harmless, said with good intentions, but that in practice can be used against you later, whether in a ticket, a hearing, or even a much more serious case. You have the right to be polite, cooperative, and still protect your legal position. One doesn't cancel out the other, and that's exactly what I'm going to show you in the next parts. 3 phrases that American drivers say every day without realizing what they're actually doing. Let's move on to the first situation. The officer has already checked your documents, everything is in order, and then they ask, "Do you mind if I take a look inside your car?" At that moment, a lot of people feel an instant pressure to seem calm, to show they have nothing to hide. And the answer comes out almost automatically. Sure, go ahead and search my car, I have nothing to hide. Sounds like the most natural thing in the world, right? If you haven't done anything wrong, why not let them? The problem is that this phrase ignores a fundamental difference that very few drivers know about. In most ordinary traffic stops, an officer does not have automatic authorization to search your vehicle. The Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution protects you against unreasonable searches and seizures. That means, without probable cause, without a warrant, or without your consent, the officer normally cannot simply go through your car. And that's exactly where the trap lies. When you say, go ahead and search, you're not just being polite. You are voluntarily granting a legal authorization that the officer might not otherwise have had. You are giving up a protection the Constitution had already given you for free. This has nothing to do with being guilty or innocent. It has to do with understanding that there's a difference between cooperating with a stop and handing over rights you didn't even know you needed to protect. A lot of people think, I'm innocent, so it doesn't make a difference. But it does. Because once the search is authorized, anything found inside that car, even something completely unrelated to the reason for the stop, can turn into a brand new problem. In practice, an attorney will almost always advise a client to never voluntarily offer that kind of consent. not because there's something wrong hidden away, but simply because there's no need to take that risk. You can, politely and calmly, say you do not consent to the search, without arguing, without getting upset, just stating your right. Phrases like, "I'd prefer not to consent to a search at this time," accomplish exactly the same thing as "go ahead and search," except without giving anything up. This isn't disrespectful to the officer, it's simply you understanding what your role is in that situation and where its limits are. And that was just the first phrase. The second one is even more common and more dangerous than it seems. Now let's move to a situation that happens to practically every American driver at some point in their life. The officer approaches the window and asks that classic question, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Or, "Do you know how fast you were going?" At that instant, the brain switches into justification mode. The person wants to seem honest, wants to seem sincere and cooperative, and ends up answering something like, "I was going just a little over the limit." Sounds harmless. It even seems like a way to soften the situation, to show good faith. But in practice, what just happened there was very different from what the driver imagined. They didn't soften anything. They confirmed, in their own words, that they knew they were over the speed limit. This is what's called a spontaneous admission. And the problem is that, once said, this phrase can be used exactly like a partial confession to the violation being investigated. The officer no longer needs to rely solely on the radar or the measuring instrument. They now have recorded or written down a statement from the driver themselves acknowledging the violation. The issue here isn't about lying to the officer. Nobody is suggesting that. The issue is understanding the difference between being polite and voluntarily hurting your own case. You can be courteous, you can be respectful, without needing to narrate details that only make your situation worse. When the officer asks if you know how fast you are going, you are not obligated to perform a self-assessment of your own violation. A response like, "I'm not sure of the exact speed," or simply, "I'd prefer not to answer that question," fulfills the role of cooperation perfectly without creating an admission that can later be used against you at a traffic hearing. This is one of the most common mistakes I've seen in years of handling cases. The driver, trying to seem sincere or to downplay the seriousness of the situation, ends up handing over exactly what was missing to seal the ticket. And the worst part, many times they don't even realize what they did until much later, when it's already too late to contest it. Remember, just because there's a stop doesn't mean you need to produce evidence against yourself right there, on the side of the road. You have the right to be economical with your answers, without being hostile or disrespectful. And if you found this second phrase dangerous, wait until you see the third one. Because this one can be the difference between a simple ticket and a criminal charge. Now we get to the most delicate scenario of all. A stop that starts out like any other, but that completely changes tone when the officer asks a specific question, "Have you had anything to drink today?" This question usually comes up when there's some suspicion that the driver might be under the influence of alcohol. And this is where the third phrase comes into play, almost always said with the intention of sounding honest and reassuring. "I only had one beer." The driver thinks, "One beer is no big deal. This shows I'm not exaggerating, that I'm being sincere." Except, in practice, what they just did was confirm, in their own words, that they consumed alcohol before driving. And from that moment on, that piece of information becomes part of everything the officer is observing and documenting. This matters because in a suspected DUI case, the officer isn't just gathering one isolated piece of evidence. They're building an entire picture. The smell of alcohol, the eyes, the way of speaking, any hesitation in movement, and now, on top of all that, a verbal confirmation from the driver themselves that they had been drinking. A phrase that seems small becomes one more piece within a body of evidence that can justify additional tests, like a field sobriety test or a breathalyzer test. The big mistake here is thinking that an explanation will calm the officer down or put an end to the suspicion. In reality, it's the opposite. The more the driver tries to justify themselves, the more information they're voluntarily handing over in a situation that's already serious by nature. You have the right to remain silent in the face of that question. This is protected under the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which guarantees that no one is required to produce evidence against themselves. You can, with complete calm and respect, say something like, "I'd prefer not to answer that question without speaking to a lawyer first. This isn't aggressive, isn't hostile, and doesn't stop the stop from proceeding. It's simply you protecting your position in a moment that can have consequences far beyond a simple ticket. In a suspected DUI case, every word can carry weight later, at a hearing, in a police report, in a prosecutor's argument. And that's exactly why, when faced with any question about alcohol consumption, polite silence and requesting a lawyer are always the safest choice, much safer than any attempt at a spontaneous explanation. Now that you've seen all three situations, you can see a pattern that repeats itself in almost every case I've handled over these years. It wasn't the search itself that hurt the driver. It wasn't the radar. It wasn't even always the breathalyzer test. Many times, it was the driver's own voice, trying to seem cooperative, that became the strongest piece of evidence against them. "Go ahead and search my car, I have nothing to hide," gave up a protection that already existed. "I was going just a little over the limit," turned into a spontaneous confession of the violation. And "I only had one beer," turned a suspicion into a verbal confirmation, documented and later used against the driver themselves. The pattern is always the same. Nervousness makes us want to over-explain, over-justify, fill every silence with a phrase that seems harmless in the moment, but carries legal weight that most people never realize until it's too late. And here's the most important point in all of this. You don't need to resolve the whole situation right there on the side of the road. This is a mistake practically everyone makes. The person thinks they need to convince the officer right then and there of their innocence, their honesty, their good intentions. But that's not how it works. If there's an unfair ticket, a questionable search, an arrest that shouldn't have happened, or any police conduct that crossed the line, all of that can, and should, be challenged later, calmly, with evidence, with the time needed to examine every detail of the stop. That's exactly what the legal process is for. The side of the road isn't the place to win your case, it's just the place to not lose it before it even begins. Being polite, cooperative, and respectful with an officer doesn't mean giving up your rights. You can hand over your documents, you can stay calm, you can even be kind in the way you speak, and still carefully choose which information you actually need to provide in that moment. Keep these three situations in mind. Keep in mind that less is more when it comes to talking too much during a stop. And if you ever find yourself in this situation, remember, you have the right to be economical with your words, without seeming hostile, without seeming guilty, just protecting what the Constitution already guaranteed you. If this video helped you see something you'd never stopped to think about before, hit like, leave a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. Because the next video might be exactly what protects you the next time those lights show up in your rearview mirror.